Welcome to Association Chat, an online discussion where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the association community. And you're here too. And we're going to be talking about today a topic that I think a lot of us hear about, hopefully don't have to worry with in our immediate. However, we might, because I want you to imagine this. What if you received a message that told you that your association members' private information was going to be released to the dark web unless you paid $847,000? I'm just pulling that figure out from the air. Unless you paid this exorbitant amount of money to the ransomware gang holding your data hostage. It sounds like a nightmarish scenario. And maybe some of you have actually faced this because more and more we are seeing that these ransomware attacks, data breaches, all kinds of different attacks on your organizations, that they're happening, and they're increasingly happening exponentially worldwide. And the likelihood of you facing some kind of issue like this is increasing every single day. So today I'm talking with two experts in data security issues who are known for their work at the Trust Bridge. I'm going to bring them up. Here we go. I have Penny Hayes and I have David Clarke with the Trust Bridge. And let me just say, Penny, you are the Chief Commercial Officer and co-founder of the Trust Bridge. David Clarke, Chief Technology Officer for the Trust Bridge and leading authority on security issues with experience across finance, telecoms, and the public sector. Welcome, Penny and David.
Thank you, KiKi. Nice to be here with you.
Well, okay. So I am thrilled that you're here. I've talked with you both before. I think the last time we were talking on Association Chat, we were talking about GDPR and what people need to do to, be forgotten if they need to be forgotten, and where the onus of responsibility fell. But today we're talking about cyber attacks and data breaches. And I wanted to share that I read this article in Fortune published in February of this year that said, and I'm going to just read for a moment, governments worldwide saw a 1,885% increase in ransomware attacks. The healthcare industry faced a 755% increase in those attacks in 2021. According to the 2022 Cyber Threat Report, ransomware also rose 104% in North America, just under the 105% average increase worldwide, according to the report. Wow. Yeah. Wow. So that's pretty intense. Why are we seeing this surge in these types of activities?
Well, what's actually quite interesting, KiKi, is that ransomware is not actually the biggest threat. Yes, it gets a lot of PR, gets a lot of attention by the media, but actually it tends to be things like what's known as business email compromise, or BEC. We like three-letter acronyms for all these things. And that's really a lot of things that happen inside an organization that could have been avoided. I think it was the FBI, David, correct me if I'm wrong, that said that 64 times more money was lost on business email compromise than actually was paid out on ransomware attacks. So yes, ransomware gets a lot of attention, but we find that actually it's not the key issue that people should be looking at. There's other things that are more important. But going back to your point about ransomware, the easy answer there would be, well, look at the world today, look what's happening. And yes, we are seeing things happening from Russia and various places like that. There's some extremely strange activity going on. People will have heard about Facebook, or as they used to be called, Facebook Meta. Apple had an attack last week. But there's other scams that are going around. And we've got one over here all over Easter eggs at the moment, and chocolate chocolate Easter eggs and how you could actually win, a year's worth of Easter eggs if you did something, clicked on a link. And of course, these kind of things hook people in, and
Oh my
then they don't
gosh.
realise that they're actually they're losing their data. But for associations, clearly holding a lot of private data about all of their members, it's absolutely critical to make sure that they've got the right data protection in place.
Well, and having the right data protection in place, it sounds like, or I think it could sound like, okay, well, we have a really great IT director. We have a really great group of people. I'm sure they're on top of it. But how does something like the remote workforce play into this? Because it's one thing if you have something suspicious going on your desktop and you're able to call for someone to come to your desk. It's another when we're all spread out, so many different places, so many different configurations. What are organizations supposed to do in this case? I mean, how does the remote workforce actually impact some of these dangers?
Well, David, we quite often, when we're talking to individual clients, say it's actually not just up to the IT department to make sure that everything's in place. Neither is it up to the data protection officer or the privacy officer to make sure. It's really up to everybody to make sure they've got their own kit involved. And we actually ensure that our clients have a data breach as well as a data protection policy in place, just in case something like this happens. But David, there are some key elements that we actually are tips that we give people. Do you want to run through some of those?
Yeah, I think they're all good points, and I think often they lead to the same thing, because often cyber protection and data protection end up being actually, we've just got a bigger problem than the cyber problem. So give you an example, we had a client, they got hit by ransomware. The phone system went down because obviously it's based on IP technology rather than the old kind of wire. But actually the real kind of cost of that problem is they had thousands of employees. That the employees' data was obviously hit by ransomware. They've now got to get their business up and running because they couldn't pay those members of staff because they are running payroll locally on their own servers, which, probably realistically they're not patched, they're not updated, their firewalls are out of date, not patched or updated. Sharing admin passwords, which didn't help, so they pretty much lost control of where the admin was. And now you've got a double problem, because you've got to get the business up and running, you've got to make sure you can pay staff, and then three, the way that a lot of this now works is, okay, your data is encrypted, you might get it back from a backup, or if you're lucky you might be able to decrypt it. But if that data has been exfiltrated, e.g. taken out of the company and put somewhere safe by bad actors, often that is then released over a period of time, and you have to pay to stop it being released. And obviously there's no real formal agreement or SLAs or enforcement, so you can't guarantee that's not going to happen or is going to happen. So effectively it becomes a very costly effect. You've got to then deal with it.
During the pandemic, when we all rushed home and everybody was then working from home, all using their own devices, there was a massive problem with data security, because people were using their own devices at home, possibly shared devices, even just sitting in a kitchen with children around or spouses. There was an element there of panic, because we were sharing data that we didn't realize we were sharing. So bringing that back under control is something that a lot of organizations are now trying to do, putting in place things like making sure everybody has company devices which they don't use for their own personal use, but also having a multi-level factor, 4 eyes, these sort of phrases that you'll hear. David can explain better than I can. But having various levels of security for people to use when they're working from home, but ensuring that they're not using perhaps shared devices, which they would have possibly been doing right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, shared devices is a difficult one, because how do you maintain that they're patched and updated? How do you make sure that someone's got a PIN code on it, to protect access to corporate data? And of course, what's happening now is manufacturing is now a target. We've had numerous targets over here, where, if anyone kind of remembers 1940s, ball bearing factories were the target for every military operation,
we're not as
because
old
without
as you, David.
bearings, sorry,
we're not as old as you.
no, but historically, ball bearings don't sound like they're very important, but actually they keep all the vehicles running, and without ball bearings you can't do it. And so, of course, what we've now seen is we saw, although not necessarily due to a cyber attack, chip shortages, because they're only made at a few factories in the world. But we have seen other, the targeted oil supply in the US. We're now seeing, and most of the manufacturing, unfortunately, they've not necessarily kind of spend a lot of resource on protecting their digital assets. We've seen lots of companies, for, give me an example, a drinks company. Why do they need to protect against cyber? Well, when you think it through, how do the lorries get the deliveries? Who do the deliveries go to? How do they take payment? So suddenly all of that is now easily targetable, not difficult to do, because potentially they've not really done much for the last 10 years. Easy targets, then has a knock-on effect. So people's work, income can all be affected. So if you want to disrupt an economy, disrupt manufacturing.
Yeah. And I just want to say that for those who are listening to this as a podcast, an audio podcast later, some really wonderful comments that are coming up on the screen as we're talking. My good friend Ron Moen, who is out there talking about his own experience at his association and what they're doing. You will want to go and watch the replay over on YouTube so that you can see some of these comments that I'm not mentioning all of them that are going across the screen, but that's what's happening for our audio listeners. And I have to say that it is such a challenge. One thing Ron was mentioning was talking about how they're moving toward a policy where no organization assets are allowed to be accessed from a personal device. And I think that that is obviously the wise way to go. That is a direction that you would want to advise everyone and try to enforce. But enforcement of that, we're talking about the association industry where there are a lot of small staff or medium staff size associations where you might have 10 people who are on staff, and the idea that someone is going to be able to monitor that activity and ensure that those protocols are being met, it's highly unlikely that is something that is going to be happening.
Exactly. So there's always going to be those type of scenarios. So quite often, and this is not an extensive list, but we've kind of recommended maybe the firm or the association pay for a proper virus checker, maybe a secure token. So when they log on, you can't be compromised or have account takeover. Much better if you've got hardware tokens rather than mobile phone applications. The one that we definitely kind of saw a lot, the last couple of years, is that people didn't realize that if you're accessing company data on your mobile phone or your iPad or whatever, if you lose it, you should tell your company so they can disable your accounts. And of course, we've had to highlight that a few times. Actually, yes, you don't really want to have to tell the company you work for you've lost your own phone. But if you're accessing company assets, it protects everybody. They can disable your account, get your password reset. So at least there is a limited amount of containment that can be done quite quickly.
But this is really part of the best practice that any organization should be putting in place, is having a data breach policy as well as a data protection policy. Now, clearly, a lot of different states in the US now are bringing in their own data protection policies. California was one of the first, but they're becoming very popular. Lots of which are based on the European GDPR that was introduced a few years ago. But having a data breach policy that is updated on a regular basis and everybody knows about is absolutely critical, because, as David always says, if you identify that there has been a data breach, who do you call? Who's the person that you get onto to say, I've lost my phone, or I think I've just clicked on a link that I shouldn't have clicked on, or people panic. So who is it that we need to call?
Oh, absolutely. And going back to that example with the company with thousands of employees, The problem is not only getting the company back up and running, you've now got to potentially have a hotline so staff can ring out if they have any issues. You've got to have financial monitoring on potentially all their bank accounts. There may be other issues that we haven't thought about. Some staff can get extremely distressed and upset. How do you cope with that? How do you kind of keep that going? And there's also the potential, of group and class actions. So it may not be the regulatory authority that does too much about it, but class actions are getting very popular over here in the UK as well as the US. So suddenly you've got all these extra personnel you need in the company to help you manage it, and it doesn't stop.
Yeah, and when I with Techer International, I end up working with a lot of boards and thinking about governance and fiduciary responsibility.
Yeah.
Where does the board come into play as far as responsibilities for ensuring that that data is protected, that they're taking the appropriate steps, and that the organization is being responsible in the way that they're going about ensuring that members' data is protected and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I know that there's a lot of question about where does that responsibility really fall? Where does it fall legally? And what can an individual do if they feel like they're looking around and they're saying, look, I don't think that we have enough of these safeguards in place to make sure that we're actually doing what we need to do to keep information safe. What does an individual do in that situation?
Under GDPR, certain organisations, depending on the size of the organisation, it usually recruit a data protection officer, and that data protection officer sits reporting to the board of directors, and they are protected. So any suggestions that they make are protected and can be put before the board without any personal implications for them. So if an organisation has a data protection officer, that's the person to channel anything like this through. What we have often found is that the data protection officer and the IT team don't necessarily speak the same language. Data protection officer quite often comes from a legal side, and legal very good at telling us, sorry to all of lawyers out there, but very good at telling us, what the law says, but not necessarily how to do things and how to implement certain policies and that sort of thing, processes. So we try and help those data protection officers to translate really what they need to say to the IT people in order to get the positions in place. But you're absolutely right about governance, and a sort of ongoing governance of any policies really needs to be taken very, very seriously, as does training. And that's an area that we've worked a lot with clients on, is making sure that everyone in the organisation understands the implications of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and the data that they control, that they not control in a data control aspect, but that they're actually having access to on a daily basis, to make sure they understand the consequences of them misusing that information in some way. So governance and training are two things that we feel very strongly should be ongoing under the policy that anybody puts in place.
And
you're absolutely right.
Sorry, Ron's just kind of put a good point in there about maybe staff being afraid of being blamed.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why we try, when we talk to companies, that they put in what we kind of call a risk committee. And the reason for that is that committee is there to manage the risk and to protect staff and the company and their customers, rather than one person taking responsibility. And it's a bit like a car. Yeah, who has responsibility for it? The mechanic who repairs the tires and the engine, etc. Yes, he certainly does. But what about the driver? And that's the board. The driver still has a responsibility to stay within speed limits, don't park in the wrong place, try not to run anybody down. So they have a lot of responsibilities of using the technology, even though they're not involved. That the driver doesn't need to know how the engine works, but he certainly needs to know how to use that engine and where to position it. And it's pulling all these components apart. Legal will have an input, IT will have an input, sales, marketing all have a component to this, HR, and it's pulling all that together. So then the risks are kind of managed, and it's very easy to say, okay, we've got a list of risks. What do we do now? And what's the probability of having this risk happen? You know what? It's impossible to work that one out. So what we tend to do is we say, okay, so you've got a risk of losing a personal device. How do you rank that? Well, we go, well, it's probably going to happen, yeah. But what have we done? What have we got in place to help mitigate that? So the first thing we would say is, well, actually, maybe the company should have a policy, whether you can use a personal device, yes or no. If the company says you can, there's a shared responsibility component on that. And then how do we make that policy work? So the policy would be, yes, you can use your mobile device. It maybe should be of a certain standard and a certain configuration, and we'll advise staff on how to do that. And then the bit that when they lose it, okay, if you want to use it, it's a benefit to the company. We appreciate that. And if you do lose it, we'd appreciate you kind of telling us a call so we could do that. Then the risk is shared, and there's actually then we can evidence there's a mitigation plan in place rather than just saying, yes, you can use it. We're going to say, yes, there's a policy and we've got guidelines. And then I think, as Ron kind of said before, they can put mobile device management software if that's acceptable to the staff. So you can then lower the risk by your actions rather than going, you know what, I think this is a 0.608 probability. Yeah, sure. That doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense that the more actions that align with mitigations must reduce risk. So then the discussion is, by how much should you reduce that risk? And that's a much easier conversation than saying, I don't think this will happen with my staff.
Right.
That
right.
doesn't make any sense.
I know it's that whole hold your breath, cross your fingers, and close your eyes. Like, please don't let this happen to us. And we all know that that's not good for any approach. for approaching any problem, it usually doesn't work. So we can just kind of skip past that one and try to figure out how we can mitigate.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we mean by governance, and actually using risk as a real tool rather than a list. I mean, we've spoken to loads of CEOs and they love risk because they just give it to their risk manager and it's not their problem anymore. But actually, if you align it with mitigations, then it makes sense.
Well, so what are some of those key questions that the senior executives should be asking their IT teams?
Well, I think that the first key element there really is, have we got a defensible position? What happens if a data breach does happen? What do we do? Do we have a defensible position? Can we deliver the rights that our members in associations scenarios, that the data subjects, as they're known in data protection law, can we deliver their rights? Can we look after them and all the data that potentially has been exposed? Do we transfer data from one country to another? Have we looked at what our third parties are doing? Do our third parties that we share information with, do they have a secure environment as we have? Do we have proper data sharing agreements with these people? There are a lot of things that we can put in place that CEOs should be asking their teams to make sure that we're making as much a secure environment as possible for guarding the data that we bring in from members and employees. As David said, employees are as important, clearly, because you hold a lot of very sensitive data about employees. I know in the association world, you may well have things like membership details with credit card and financial information, but clearly with employees, you've probably got health information, you've got credit card financial information, all sorts of pension information. So making sure that you can deliver the rights on those is absolutely critical, and that involves having a data protection policy. And policies shouldn't just be written down on a piece of paper, they should be reviewed on a regular basis. Going back to governance again, one of the things people ask us is, should we test out our data breach policy by having a sort of fake scenario? Well, David and I have run fake scenarios, and they can actually be quite good fun for us, but they can be quite scary. And sometimes you by putting in a fake scenario, you're actually over exaggerating some of the things that can certainly happen. But having having a really good idea of the types of things that could happen and where there are vulnerabilities in the organization is absolutely critical. And it all comes back down really to looking at a risk assessment and seeing where potentially some of the holes are in your policies and in your security. So there are key questions like that. I think, David, a massive percentage of data breaches tend to happen in the third-party supply chain.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And that that's something that all organisations should be very, very attentive to having data sharing agreements with anybody that they share data with. And I know in the association world, people like sponsors are always asking for to have information on delegates at events and that sort of thing. Well, you need to be very careful about the data sharing agreements and make sure that those sponsors have in place the sorts of policies that you would expect them to have in order that they don't misuse or put at risk any data that you share with them. So there are a list of certain things that we do advise CEOs to check with, and we can certainly share that with you.
And we work with companies a lot on what we call their escalation procedures, you know, the Ghostbusters, who you're going to call. And, you know, that's really what it comes down to. So, you know, does everybody know who to call? Is that person always available? Do they have a backup? Do they know who to call? Because certainly there's going to be business decisions need to be made. They need to have, you know, we've had breaches where the CEO kind of doesn't want to be on the call. And we're going, no, you've got to be on the call. There's some decisions here that are going to cost your company big bucks. You probably should be part of this. And eventually, you know, we get them on the call and they understand why they need to be part of it. And we ask sort of companies do something sounds very simple, but companies are getting more and more complicated. What are your critical assets? E.g., if they went away for maybe more than 10 minutes, would it cause you a problem? You know, could you survive for 4 hours? Could you survive for a day before it becomes a problem? And it's not just having the application or service backup. It's maybe the service with the data that you've developed over the last 3 years. You may need access to that as well. So it's working out those type of times. So I'll kind of give you an example. You know, maybe a company is very dependent on Teams. You know, they use it for chat, they use it for sharing files. That for some reason is not available. What else are you going to use? What's your alternative plan? Could you use another technology, or do we have to go back to phone and text and paper? You know, they're all realistic options. And then who's in charge of that? Who then decides when is the time to go back from paper back to Teams? Is Teams stable? So there's a lot of decisions to be made, and that's just one application. And bearing in mind, you know, average company is going to have between 5 and 10 super critical applications that if it's out, it could cost them revenue, business, and their customers revenue in their business. It's kind of managing it.
So one of the questions that comes to mind is, you know, when you go to you at this point, you've worked with so many different types of organizations, associations of every size, of every type, in like all kinds of different industries. What's probably the top issue, the top mistake that is like a glaring error that you see when you first go into work with an organization? Is there consistency? Is there like a most common problem?
Probably you're kind of right. Let's not kind of go kind of too technical, but the main thing really is kind of what we call governance, and maybe the definition, I suspect in everybody's heads, governance means something different. And if we go back to the car analogy, who is responsible for checking the tires aren't bald and there's oil in the engine on a regular basis? Because, you know, if you drive that car every day for a certain period of time, something is going to go wrong with it. Who checks it? And it's the same with IT. Who is coordinating these hundreds of components that they're patched, they're updated, they're fit for purpose, joiners, movers, levers, who's got access, who shouldn't have access? It's an ongoing process. It's not a one-off and then we're okay for the next 10 years. It's ongoing. So it's really putting that level of control. And that, as we said earlier, that's a shared responsibility, because sometimes you may not have enough money, resources, or staff. So we've got to say, you know what, that's a risk, and that's something we'll either have to accept or we have to find the cash to fix it.
But actually, what's been really quite surprising to us over the last 4 years, really, is that when we go into an organisation, is actually who knows where all the data is and where it's going, and even more so in the last couple of years when people have been working from home, is, you know, you've heard the expression a data map, having a data flow and understanding where that data is, not just within the organisation, but also out into the third-party supply chain. And, you know, that's, I'm talking about suppliers and sponsors and anybody that you share data with. And it's been quite astounding to us how few organisations that we've worked with actually understand that, and therefore can understand where potentially there has been a compromise.
And so that's why the governance bit helps, because all that should be reflected and controlled via, you know, we've got some data, how are we going to use it? Where should it be stored? Who's controlling it? So it's it sounds worse than it is, but once it's in place, it works really well. And we always sort of recommend, depending how big the organization is, every area has a risk champion.
A risk
And
champion.
and it's their kind of role to kind of highlight that to their local team, or bring it back to the governance for them to make that decision, so that the risks don't have to be managed locally, and staff accepting risks they probably shouldn't be accepting. Because I certainly would. I remember a long time ago, for a really big, huge utility company, I said, "Oh, I kind of need access to this," and they gave me a super user password. Absolutely fantastic. It really had access to every bit of data they had. And when I realized that, I went back and said, "Take this away. I don't want that responsibility."
Yeah. Super helpful for me. Also super scary. This exists. And right. Absolutely.
And so, fun to have, but great responsibility, kind of quoting Spider-Man, but it kind of comes with it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I think I always think of, my friends who are the executive directors, and maybe there's, 8 to 10 people on staff, and they are trying to navigate, at this point, they're trying to navigate everything from, what's a hybrid meeting? Do we need to change our business model? How do I keep the board happy? How do I keep good talent? And they have all of these different things that they're trying to solve for in their associations. And then, then there's this, and I don't know what kind of panic would set in when one of them received an email that said, like I talked about at the very beginning, where it's like, we've got your members' data, or if they got a phone call from someone who works for them and says, hey, I lost the laptop and I've noticed some weird stuff happening lately. Not sure what to do. And I think about that panic and I think, oh my gosh, what do you do at that point? So how can we give them like a first step on how to avoid that?
That's a great example. And I think the one thing that almost every company can do is work out their escalation process. Exactly. When you see this, who are you going to call? And some of the really big companies I work for, I kind of basically sort of the policy that I kind of wanted and I put in place and it worked was, if anybody suspects anything, and there's no point giving staff a 15-page list of, if it's any one of these things, cool, because the time you finish that list, I guarantee the thing that you're looking at won't be on that list. It's just, if you feel it is, if you think it is, cool, because I'd rather deal with it quickly and downgrade it rather than have something that's really big and then we've left it for 2 days and lost any window of opportunity to fix it. And I was kind of told, you know what, you'll get inundated. You know what? It didn't happen. And these
and
are
it
big
didn't
companies
happen
with tens of thousands of staff. The only bit that I kind of did get inundated, and I did manage to, inverted commas, outsource it, was when I kind of ran a lot more of the physical security, because then I'd get somebody ringing up, I've lost my scarf, or someone's stolen my office chair, and it's like, okay, fine.
My lunch,
so
my
lunch,
we say,
but other than that, I got to say, every call was really sensible, and I would rather have someone's suspicion rather than they fully qualified it, because by then it's too late.
Right.
So the way that we always recommend, treat it seriously, maximum effort, then bring the level down. And then that way, people get used to, talking to you, ringing you up, and they know they're not going to get, shot or kind of made fun of or whatever, because everything, people know their environments really well. And they will certainly kind of have this natural instinct something's not right. And I'd rather rely on staff who do this all day long than them trying to have a fully qualified problem. That thing works so well, having a good escalation process.
And having that process in place also enables the organisation to determine how serious the breach is. And under the some of the data protection laws, you're supposed to report or notify the regulatory authorities, and even in some cases the actual data subjects who've been affected. You don't have to do that in all cases. So. And also it can cause panic, mostly in the media, but also amongst employees. So actually going through that process to understand how serious the breach has been. We've done a couple of breach processes for organisations where we've come to the conclusion, actually, it's not as bad as it seemed in the first place. Therefore, it's not necessary to report. It's not necessary to notify. And actually, we can sort it all out without everybody going into panic, and without actually everybody being told about it, because it's not necessary. So I think going through that process and having that policy in place, make sure that everybody understands exactly what's going on at every stage. And I think that's quite important too, in terms of communication.
And Ron, sorry, Ron's
ahead.
put a question in. Sorry, shall I quickly answer? Ron, thanks for the question. Ronald, he's asked if, you know, a maturity model for cybersecurity and cyber strategy that we kind of recommend. There's loads of good ones out there that you can use. We'd probably initially kind of recommend that you start really simply so you get the hang of it. And if you align it to your kind of risk profile, e.g. you get your risk, what's acceptable to the company, and then monitor that over time so you can see the risk going down for justifiable reasons, you'll probably get a lot of initial benefits straight away. It's kind of easy. You know, some of the maturity models compare with other companies in your industry. That's kind of like comparing your own car to your neighbor's car. Doesn't really have any value because you don't really know how that company's run or what they do, even if they're in the same industry. Right. So, you know, they're kind of good ideas, but we kind of generally recommend that you maybe initially just develop your own and then see how that works. So you can say, you know what, we're better last week than we were this week than we are last week. And you can monitor the progress on a regular basis. And then that way you develop your own maturity and you go, you know what, this is working for us, rather than you know, looking at controls that don't even have any relationship to your business.
Yeah, that's absolutely cool.
I just, you know, I love talking to both of you because, you know, you make me feel like there's the worst case scenario, and then I look at it and I'm like, oh, there could be a better story there. Things could turn out okay. I could feel like I have a little bit better grasp on making sure that I'm doing what I need to do. And that's always such a good gift to be able to provide people. So I wanted to say thank you on a personal level, like that you can make me feel like at least I have a better grasp on some of the things that I need to do. I think for association executives who are looking at some ideas for things that they can do next, we've given them a lot of them. I know that you both have workshops and training, and you have some that are coming across the United States in a couple of places. You've generously given association chat members discount code for us to be able to share for people who hear this and want to participate and sign up for some of these. Can you tell me a little bit about some of these workshops that are coming up? Because if somebody can attend and learn more and actually get into the details and come up with some of the things that they need to do to take back to their associations, it would be really great for them to be able to meet with you, to ask their questions directly and to learn in person. So what's coming up and when are they happening?
Sure. We're running several sessions, or they're half-day sessions. We're doing 2 in Atlanta on the 22nd of April and 2 in Fairfax in Virginia on the 28th. I'm just checking my diary here, 28th of April. And the idea of these is, yes, come along with any questions, any problems, any issues that you may have. But we will go through a sort of, not dissimilar to what we're talking about here in terms of a data breach policy that we would put in place. And we'd actually demonstrate things like the risk assessments that David was talking about, which then show development over time, again, as he was talking about within the maturity assessment. We ran one here a couple of weeks ago for a private one for a client, and we actually did a scenario for them. And the great thing about the scenario was it was similar to their own business, but it was expanding on certain things that we knew that had happened to them. And what that was able to do was to identify gaps in their own organizational policies and processes. And so they were people from various different divisions of one organization, and they were able to go away and put in place additional techniques, additional policies and processes that they needed to do. So that's really what our workshops are about. It's looking at an individual's current problems and concerns, and actually helping them identify how they can actually mitigate some of those issues. So that's really what our databases are about. We're going to focus on data breaches, but we're also going to be looking at the regulations that are coming in across various US states in the course of the next year, and looking obviously at the ones that are in place at the moment. We'd love there to be a federal one, which would mean that we could all work together on the same one. They are all very similar, to be honest. There are some differences, but a lot of that's in the reporting side of things. So we'll take a look at those and make sure that everybody understands what should be in place in their own organisations to mitigate risk. So that's really where our workshops are going to be very interactive. That's really where we're hoping people will bring their own problems, if you like, and their own scenarios, and we can talk through those. Obviously, all completely confidentially. But I can send you some more information about those as well, so that people can see the loose agenda. I mean, it is a loose agenda. It will cover certain aspects, but we wanted some interaction from our audience, our participants there as well.
Well, and I think that it's that will be really helpful. And if you go, anyone who didn't see the links or get a chance to really look at those, I know they flashed across the screen. I tried to put them in the comments. You can also go to associationchat.com after this. And if you check on the cybersecurity article that's there that talks about this interview, then at the bottom, then I'll have the links there and the code, and you can go grab information over there too. So associationchat.com, hopefully easy to remember. So, I know that we've talked about a lot of the specifics about and generalities about cybersecurity, the cyber attacks and data breaches. What's the overall trend that you're seeing? I know we talked about the GDPR legislation. We're talking about the legislation that then happened in California and in New York. I keep hearing more and more. We're getting more and more involved. It's not going away. It's not like it's just getting more and more intense. Where do you see things going based on the trajectory of the legislation that we're seeing happening and the real world issues that are coming up having to do with some of these cyber attacks and data breaches? And I'm asking you to sort of be a psychic here. I realize I'm asking you to be psychic.
I think one of the trends that we've seen a huge amount of, especially in the last couple of years, maybe slightly less than that, is the amount of due diligence companies are doing on companies in their supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
At one time it was like here a couple of questions. We often now see it's 200 or 300 questions. Sometimes it's also an interview with a third party as well to get through it. So we've seen the due diligence getting really, really tough. And not only do they want to see policies, procedures, they want to see evidence supporting it, which is quite interesting because they want to protect their business. And I suppose one of the reality is most businesses only make money by selling to bigger businesses or the same size. So it's not like you can say no.
Yeah, we're on call with one of our clients over here in the UK. Is a global research company, but they're based here in the UK. And I think we probably get a call from them at least once a month because a new customer of theirs is putting them under the spotlight. So David's absolutely right. It's looking at contracts, it's reviewing data sharing agreements, it's those things that are happening more and more. And of course, the due diligence goes not just across supply chain, but for people who are looking for investment, or they're wanting to sell their companies or merge with organizations. And there's been some pretty high profile disastrous cases, the Marriott Hotel one being the classic, but that really spurred a lot of extra due diligence going on for any mergers or acquisitions out there. But yes, that in particular, I think David's absolutely right. That's been an area that we've seen a lot of work happening in the last few years. Cyber insurance is another thing that a lot of people have been taking out over the course of the last few years. We actually ran a webinar last year on whether or not we think cyber insurance is worth the money. We never didn't really come to a conclusion on that, but what we did decide is that having a data breach policy and a data protection policy in place was actually probably more practically a better solution than actually just paying somebody for some cyber insurance, definitely. So there are some key things like that we're seeing people spending money on, but actually having the policies and processes there in the first place is really the key thing, and making sure everybody in the organisation knows what those are. Definitely.
Well, I so thank you so much for joining me today and for talking about these issues. I have to say, I don't think that they're going to go away. I think we're going to continue to have more. I think I'm going to continue to have a reason to have you come back. So what I'm trying to tell you, Penny and David, is that I feel like this is a long-term relationship. We really need to continue to develop and invest in our relationship together, because I feel like I'm going to have you come back to talk to the audience here at Association Chat. We certainly appreciate your help. I appreciate your information that you shared with us today. And so if there's one thing that people can do after they have listened to this, after they've heard our interview today, what's the one thing that you would suggest that people do? Obviously, reach out to you, but one other thing. Penny, David?
I think I know what David would say. I would suggest they take a risk assessment to look at what their risk appetite is, but also to understand where potentially the risks are for their organisation.
Okay.
Yeah, and probably kind of the usual is make sure you've got a good escalation process, because then you can fix things. Otherwise, you have no chance. All
right. Well, thank you so much. And I have to say, wow, what a fantastic interview. I just love my time with the Trust Bridge. David and Penny, Carol Tolo, who's involved. She wasn't on today, but I'm telling you, what an amazing group of people that are just very generous with their information. Please go visit the Trust Bridge, find out more about their offerings. Go to associationchat.com, read about the workshops that are coming up, take advantage of the lessons. They also have they actually have some education that you can enroll in online. So if you want to take your team through virtual training, they have online education as well. I'll try to remember to put that in some of the show notes so that you'll be able to link to that in a little bit. But I hope you got something that you can use, something of value that will help you and protect your organizations today and in the future. If you have any questions, if you want to find out more, if you want to connect with David and Penny, please look for their information, connect there, but also send me your questions if you want us to do a follow-up episode, because that's something that I think, like I said before, I don't see this going anywhere. I think that, in fact, we're probably going to continue to have more and more issues of this sort, unfortunately. And until next time, everyone, keep asking questions to learn every day. Because, as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. We got to stay curious, everyone. All right. Have a great rest of the week.